Welcome back to the Camera Gear Podcast. I'm Daniel.
I'm Lucas.
And we're here today to talk more about the gear side of photo and video. We've got some interesting topics today, and we're going to start with some recent drama between Canon and Viltrox. So, Lucas, can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, so Viltrox has been making autofocus lenses. I assume that most people are familiar with Viltrox. They kind of come across as like a cheap brand, but really they make some solid lenses. Decent optics, maybe not, comparable to like your G Masters and your Red Ring Canon lenses, but pretty good lenses for basically half of what you're going to see as far as price compared to, your Sony or your Fujis. Viltrox has been making autofocus lenses for R mount, and Canon sent a cease and desist letter to them. It wasn't public, but it became public after somebody was asking, hey, Viltrox, why did you take these R-mount lenses out of the store? And they're like, well, it's not our fault. Canon told us to stop. And I thought that was really interesting because it seemed like for the longest time, people have been opening up to third parties. Tamron and Sigma have been making lenses for EF and lenses for E forever. And so to me, I always thought it was a given that Canon was let other people make autofocus glass, but apparently the autofocus algorithms for R mount aren't public, and they want to have control of it.
Is it just the autofocus algorithm, or is it the whole RF mount? I mean, are there any third-party RF lenses?
I don't know. I think that Viltrox was the only one who was doing it, but that's not uncommon for Viltrox. They kind of jump to the market, make something for make things for any mount, and then they sell cheap glass because that's kind of their position. It's like, we're going to undercut everybody, and most people don't need the most perfect glass. They just need something in this focal length. There's probably some Samyang, maybe some Rokinon stuff out there, but I don't know if it's a mount infringement or if it's a autofocus infringement.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I mean, it is surprising to see because it feels like those third-party lenses are still good. I mean, we both have third-party lenses for our cameras, and they're good lenses. I mean, we don't have any complaints about them, really. And I mean, sometimes they're not as good as a first-party lens for whatever reason, but it's a good option to have. And so it's kind of a bummer that you don't have that option on Canon if they're not allowing that.
It feels like Canon's often compared to Apple as far as they're the Apple of the camera industry or whatever. And they make their own sensor, and they're making their cameras, and they do the thing where they want to, maybe they don't have the best specs, but they're trying to have the best overall experience. Like you look at the EOS R, and it was this flagship camera that was great, and even though maybe the specs didn't totally match up, it was this whole package. Mm-hmm. And so it's Canon's, the Apple of the camera industry. And this feels like just another step in that direction.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, the RF lenses aren't cheap either. I used to have an EOS R, and there were a couple of cheaper lenses that came out, that 51.8 that was $250 or something, and there's an 85 that was pretty reasonable. But a lot of those RF lenses are super, super expensive. You're paying $1,000 or $2,000 for a normal lens.
Seems like a lot of other camera brands have focused on using Canon's mount. Red, Blackmagic, they both use EF mount, and they've since released things with R mount, cameras with R mount. And I mean, Canon's not giving them a cease and desist for making cameras with their lens mount. I guess they just want to own the lens ecosystem. But there's not a ton of R lenses, and it feels like these manufacturers maybe made their cameras with the same mount as Canon out of good faith. It felt like a given that R was just going to be the mirrorless version of EF. And here comes Canon stepping in and saying, no, we're going to own this lens mount, and we're going to own the autofocus for it, and no one else is going to make it, and we're going to make all the money.
It kind of makes you wonder, if you're Red and you made the Komodo with an RF mount, what are they thinking right now?
Yeah, exactly.
Because nobody else is going to be able to make autofocus lenses for that system. I hope people are happy buying Canon lenses.
Yeah, and I'm sure that Red is maybe not so much worried about autofocus because no one's really autofocusing on those kind of cameras. And maybe it's not the end of the world to just swap it out with a PL mount. I'm pretty sure that most of those cinema cameras, you can just change the mount on that. And so that's maybe not a huge deal, but also, I mean, if I was Blackmagic, I'd be rethinking, what I'm going to do, because Canon's not making any new EF glass. They're only focused on R. And now it's pretty clear that they want to be the only ones in that space.
Yeah. Don't know what to think about that. It's weird to see it. I mean, we don't know what happened behind the scenes. Maybe Viltrox never talked to them. And I mean, if it was just, they reverse engineered it and released it, I can understand why they would do that. I mean, it's kind of like trademarks. You have to protect trademarks by suing people that use them. Like if you want to keep your trademark, you have to defend it. And I wonder if it's a similar thing where they have to do this in some way. But
obviously Canon is justified in that, like, they made the camera, they made the lens. And, like, sure, why not let them own, the money and everything from that and the profits and all that stuff. But as far as, like, the camera industry and these gear manufacturers, I mean, it's just kind of been a given that, like, if a lens maker wants to reverse engineer your autofocus system and then release something, sure, people can buy it and they understand that, like, yeah, the autofocus may not really work or may not be that great. I mean, I used a Fringer EF to XF adapter for years, and that Fringer adapter came out before Fuji released autofocus, information for their cameras. That was all proprietary, but they reverse engineered it for all these lenses, and, Fuji never sued them as far as I know. And it seems like it was a gentleman's agreement across the board that, sure, the camera manufacturers may not make the stuff about their mount public, but letting other people reverse engineer it was okay. So a little weird that they slapped Viltrox's wrist.
It is weird. Do you think that if you were in the market for a camera, would this sort of news stop you from buying into the Canon RF system?
It would make me second guess it. I think that whenever you're buying a camera, like people say, you marry your lenses, date bodies, and I switched from Micro Four Thirds to Fuji, and I don't think it was a huge lift for me to just sell all of my lenses and then buy new. And you recently did that you sold a lot of your Canon stuff and bought into Fuji. And I feel like maybe that's not so much of the problem, to have to sell everything to switch. But whenever, I'm making those decisions, I am thinking a lot about, what lens mount am I getting into? And if I'm investing thousands of dollars into, good lenses and glass, I want to be able to know I'm going to be able to use it on the next thing. And I mean, you're locking yourself into a camera mount regardless. So whether or not you're locking yourself into Canon's R or, Sony's E, it's whether or not, you're going to be okay with using only manufacturer glass.
I kind of agree with you. I mean, I always heard that same logic about, like dating bodies and marrying lenses, but I don't know. I mean, unless you have tons and tons of lenses or if you have something really rare or something, it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal to sell stuff and switch. It doesn't seem worth it to me to stay with something that you're not super happy with just because you have lenses in that system.
But to go back to the question of, like, is this a turnoff for Canon? Depending on what you're doing, you only need a handful of lenses. And if Canon had all the R-mount lenses that you need for what you're going to do, maybe it's probably fine. It's frustrating that there aren't any cheaper options. Like, you're not going to be able to go out and buy, a Sigma Zoom that's comparable but $1,000 less. But more often than not, I would prefer to have the brand name lens. I would rather have, all Fuji glass or all Sony glass instead of mixing in some, Sigma and Tamron, even though those are perfectly acceptable lenses, and I have one of each of those for my camera. I don't know. I think I would prefer to have manufacturer glass, so I don't think it's necessarily a turn off. But it is kind of frustrating to see them close themselves off from the third-party industry.
Yeah, I think I agree. In terms of the main lenses, it doesn't really concern me, but it is a little concerning if you wanted any sort of specialty lens. If you wanted a anamorphic lens or something like that. I mean, Canon's not going to make an RF anamorphic lens. Or maybe they are. Maybe they have one. I don't know. But it just feels like some stuff like that is going to be more limited, and so I'd like to have third parties be able to make stuff like that. I kind of agree. I don't think it would stop me from buying a Canon RF camera, but it's at least something I would think about, and I'd like to see them reverse that decision.
I guess, we have to wait to see what else comes out of this. I mean, who else is making RF glass? And is it just Viltrox? Like, do they maybe have something specific against Viltrox here? Or is it everybody?
Yeah. Are you looking to see if Canon has...
I am looking to see. Sigma has not released any Canon RF mirrorless lenses. Oh. So yeah, there you go.
Maybe that's why. Well, I think that ties in pretty well with the next thing we wanted to talk about, which was lens adapters. So sometimes you have a camera of a certain mount and you have a lens of a different mount and you want to use them together. There are all kinds of different adapters you can buy that let you do that. And we've had the opportunity to use a lot of those different adapters. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about that and kind of what our experiences have been, what the pros and cons of that is, and how we feel about it, whether we would want to use them in the future. So what have your experiences been with using those sorts of adapters?
Yeah, so I guess first I should know which adapters I've used. And I mentioned it earlier, but I've used the Fringer EF to XF. And I've used some dumb metal, $30 FD to FX, which is old film lenses. And on some of the other projects that we've worked on, we've used EF to L mount, which is for Panasonic. And then what have you used?
Well, so we both, I think, used an EF to an E. So
right.
A Canon lens to a Sony E mount. And then I've used a Viltrox Micro Four Thirds speed booster. So that goes from full frame EF glass down to Micro Four Thirds. And because that one's a speed booster, it has glass in the adapter, and the speed booster basically takes the image circle from the full frame lens and shrinks it down to Micro Four Thirds.
Yeah, it intensifies the light. It gains you 0.71 times on that light coming in, so that it reduces your or increases the amount of stops of range you have.
Right, and so you've got both types of things. Not every adapter has glass in it, and the speed booster has some advantages, but it also has some disadvantages that you have extra glass between your camera sensor and the lens. Let's set the speed booster aside for a moment. Let's talk about just the adapters. I mean, what do you think about those? Have they been reliable for you? Like, do you feel like it's the same as using native glass, or is it worse?
Yeah, so having used an adapter for a number of different EF lenses to my Fuji camera, I kind of can't stand it anymore. I'm kind of tired of it. It's, obviously there's like any lens, there's always maybe like a little bit of play like in the lens mount, especially if you've used the camera for multiple years and you're like swapping a lot of lenses out. There's always like just a smidge of play. And it's not a big deal, it's fine. But with the lens mount, it's like there's play where the lens attaches and then also where the mount attaches to the camera. And it always feels like there's just like a little too much wiggle there. And I never feel really great about how secure it is. And optically, it's typically fine, but I mean, one of the big advantages of mirrorless is that you can get the back element of the lens closer to the sensor. And
what effect does that have?
And the closer those are together, the sharper your images are going to be.
Okay.
And so by using an adapter, you are agreeing to have like maybe a less secure mount and not as natively supported autofocus, and your images aren't going to be quite as sharp as if you were using something that mounts directly to the camera. I mean, obviously that didn't stop me from using like a 24-105 or an 85 on my Fuji camera from EF, but after a while it just kind of came down to me wishing that I had, more native glass. And I think maybe half of it was the build and the connection, but the other half was the autofocus and it not doing like the slow focus pulls. And specifically for the Fringer, the autofocus function was good enough and it was fine. But for sometimes with an unsupported lens or in, some edge cases, you would go to do like a focus, and if it was like all the way at infinity and you were trying to focus to minimum, the lens might the adapter might geek out, and then the lens starts like slamming against its edge of its autofocus, and it's like click 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 click, and then the camera shuts down. I know that you had that problem with the Viltrox on the GH5 where you I guess the camera locked up and I had to pull the battery out.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask if you had experienced any of those issues, because you mentioned that the adapter's a little bit loose on the frame, and I was curious whether that was just a feeling, or whether you had actually seen effects of that. Because what I saw with the Viltrox one, I mean, those adapters all have electrical contacts in them because it has to be able to send signals from the camera through the adapter and then to the lens so that you can actually do the autofocus and all that. And yeah, with the Viltrox, sometimes I think it was because it was a little loose, but it was like sometimes it would glitch out and do something to the camera to where it would lock the camera up. And I couldn't even turn the camera off with a switch. I had to pull the battery out to reset it, which is really bad whenever you're in the middle of trying to shoot an event or something and the stuff is happening right in front of you. And it's, okay, guys, sorry, I've got to turn my camera off and back on. Hopefully I get to the battery because I need to get to it to fix this thing. It's just not a good experience.
Specifically with that problem on the GH5 and the Viltrox, there was a situation where you pull the battery out and you put it back in, and you're not guaranteed what settings you're going to go back to. And there was some stuff that I was editing that you shot on a project where the white balance was totally off because you had to pull the battery, and Nick didn't realize that it changed the white balance on you.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so like that can be frustrating.
And I have to admit, I mean, that's a cheap adapter. So,
yeah, it is.
So you can buy Metabones is the company that makes good speed boosters, and the Metabones Micro Four Third speed boosters somewhere around $600, something like that. And my Viltrox one was like $140. So it's definitely like the budget option, but it just doesn't give you a good feeling about your gear whenever you're using it, and it's not reliable, and you don't know what's going to happen.
The EF to E adapter that we've used is Metabones, right?
That's right.
I once always felt almost native. I mean, I haven't really had any issues with that. I mean, we use it mostly in manual focus, but
I've never had problems with it either. And I think it's better than the speed booster in the sense that it doesn't have the glass in there. I think that helps. But I agree. I haven't had any trouble with that one.
I would be really interested in doing a speed booster to APS-C because it makes it almost as large of an image as full frame, and so you can get like that full frame look or whatever with the speed booster. Maybe get that extra one-ish stop of light. And so I've been really interested to try something like the Metabones EF to XF adapter, but I never have. And I know a lot of people, some people do use those. But I do want to try. Maybe we said a lot of negative things about these adapters, so I'm gonna try upselling on it. I bought one specifically without the speed booster in it because I didn't want anything extra in there. I didn't want to like lose any light or lose any sharpness or have any bowing on the edge and whatever. And using that fringer with the contacts in it, I mean, every single photo video I took, it reports back what lens I took it on with the f-stop correctly. And so that information is always communicated back, and it even says, this was a Tamron EF85. So that's great, and that works. And then if you're adapting to a smaller sensor, which, obviously you can adapt EF to E, which is full frame to full frame. Sometimes you can get vignetting. But what I've been doing is adapting EF to XF. And so you're cropping out the center of that lens, which is going to be the sharpest portion of the lens. So you're kind of cropping out the best part of it, and then it gives you this whole other range of focal lengths. I mean, most of your zooms are the full frame equivalent of 24 to 70 or 24 to 105. And whenever you go to buy your primes, like Fuji makes a bunch of great primes, but like they make a 35, which is roughly a 50. They make a 56, which is roughly an 85, and they make a 90, which is roughly a 135. But they don't make a 135 and they don't make an 85. And whenever I go and I shoot on the Canon 24 to 105 f4 lens, I mean, that's like 35 to, almost 150. And it's kind of fun and interesting to have this different range because it gives you the opportunity, maybe get more reach if you're shooting event stuff, or just kind of have a different effect. I really loved shooting on that 85 millimeter lens on APS-C. I mean, it was the equivalent of maybe like 120 millimeter, portrait type lens, but the compression was phenomenal, and it just it made everything look super, super good. So I kind of, I like and will keep using the adapter for that reason, because it opens up other opportunities to me. Maybe like the ability to use a Canon 70 to 200, so I can have that extra length and also have, a pretty decent lens.
Well, and I think there are some lenses that you can only get in EF, or even some of the old, you can get an adapter for Canon FD to whatever modern mount you want, and so if you wanted to use vintage lenses, or if you just had an old lens lying around, they're good for that. It's cool to have those options. I think they make a lot of sense if you already have lenses in a different mount, or if you have a reason to own lenses in a different mount. So if you own a Canon EF camera and you own a Fuji camera or a Sony camera, then sure, you can buy an adapter for $200 to $500 and be able to use all of those lenses on both of your cameras. That's cool to have that ability. But I guess where I draw the line is, if I was looking to buy a lens for a camera, I think my first choice would always be to buy something for the native mount rather than buy something that I'm going to adapt. I mean, when I sold all the Canon gear, I kind of mentioned that earlier, that I sold a bunch of Canon gear and got into Fuji. One of the things I had was an EF 70 to 200, and I definitely had the thought, I could just buy that Fringer adapter and I could use that 70 to 200 on my Fuji camera. And I kind of had to weigh that against just selling that lens, not buying the adapter, and getting the equivalent Fuji X-mount lens that would just natively mount to the camera. And I just think that if you have the choice between those, I think that's always the right choice. It's going to be smaller, more reliable. Like, if I don't have to use an adapter, I'm not going to, but like you said, there are good reasons that they're there, and I'm glad they exist.
Yeah, and it's cool to have it in a pinch, but I 100% agree with you. I'm unlikely to go out and buy more EF lenses. Like, I have the 24-105 and I have the 7200 because I inherited them, and it's cool to be able to like use them, or for the period of time where you were using EF lenses, I could borrow one of your lenses. But the adapters kind of ended up putting you in a weird spot, specifically because you had the RF and you had the GH5, and then you had a series of EF lenses that you were adapting to both cameras, and so you kind of had lenses that matched both cameras but didn't mount to either one natively. And then you're like, I don't want to buy any more EF lenses because they don't mount to any of my cameras, but I don't want to buy any RF lenses because I'm using the GH5 for video, but I don't want to buy any Micro Four Thirds lenses because they don't work for my photo camera, and maybe I don't want to buy more Micro Four Thirds cameras. And so like you were in a tough spot. You feel like you couldn't buy any lenses.
Well, and that's kind of the funny thing about EF, because I mean, the other thing we haven't mentioned is that some of these newer mirrorless mounts, you can't really adapt to other mounts because that distance between the back of the lens and the sensor, or the flange distance, is so short. Like, you can't take a Canon RF lens and adapt that to a different mount. There's just not enough space for that adapter.
Right. That's worth explaining maybe a little further. Is like the whole reason you can adapt things is because the distance from the sensor to the back of the lens has to be a certain exact distance. And whenever you take the mirror out of a camera, you have a pretty good distance there that you can work with. I think that there are some mirrorless to mirrorless adapters because the distance for E-mount is actually pretty far compared to something like Nikon, which is extremely close. But you're still dealing with like millimeters.
Yeah. Maybe they exist, but I mean, just as an example, I haven't really seen anything where you can take a Canon RF lens and adapt that to any other system.
No. Well, they're not going to let you anyways because they'll just sue your pants off.
Yeah, that's true. Don't try to make that adapter. Bad things will happen.
Bad idea. Yeah, boy. So I would be interested in trying more adapters in the future, specifically to do the speed booster thing. Because bringing that back into the conversation, that might be a reason to do it. Maybe you want to have those extra stops of light, or maybe you want to make your APS-C or Micro Four Thirds camera look more like a full frame camera or whatever. And I would be interested to see, what does that full frame look on a Fuji lens?
I mean, we have to say speed boosters are super common. It's not a rare thing to get. Plenty of people use them. It was a really common setup when the Blackmagic 4K was a popular camera because that camera had a Micro Four Thirds mount, but everyone wanted to use EF lenses with it. And something like the Sigma 18 to 35, people wanted to use that on the Blackmagic camera, and so it was like everyone buying the Blackmagic 4K just put an extra $600 in their budget to buy the Metabone speed booster, and it was a very common combination. Yeah. I mean, it was so common that when they came out with the 6K, they just gave it an EF mount because it's what people wanted. But I mean, something like that makes sense, and I used to own that 18 to 35, and it was great that when I put it on the GH5, it was giving me f1.2.
Yeah.
I mean, it was you do get that extra stop of light and a little bit of a wider field of view. I think it multiplies going from EF to Micro Four Thirds. It multiplies it by like 0.7x or something, and so you get a little bit wider view. And I mean, it was nice. I liked it. I didn't like the specific adapter I had, but I'm on board with the idea of a speed booster. I think.
I guess maybe one of the other advantages / disadvantages would be that extra element in there may soften up the image. But like, if your complaint is that you've turned the sharpness down to -4 on your XH2S and it's just still too sharp, You could put like an old crappy vintage lens on a speed booster and then put that on the camera, and it probably would be just incredibly soft.
I mean, the speed booster is basically just like having a Pro Mist filter built in, right?
I mean, usually what I like to do is I like to take the speed booster and rub some Vaseline on it and then put the lens on there.
Yeah.
And that makes it even softer.
Yeah. Don't try that at home.
That's how they shot all the dream sequences in Veronica Mars.
Oh, that's so gross. How do you clean that off?
I don't know. Maybe like you have your Vaseline lenses over here. Like you take them off the camera and you set them like end down into the Vaseline, and that's just how you store them.
I mean, that's definitely a use case for renting gear.
Why is this sticky? Don't worry about it. We were shooting a dream sequence.
I wonder, like, can you put the lens cap on the lens after it's had the Vaseline on it?
I mean, it probably
kind of slip
it
off?
wouldn't fall off. Maybe I think it would just stick on there, right?
Yeah, maybe so.
Okay.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Last thing I wanted to talk about today was the Fuji X-H2. So that came out fairly recently, and we both own an X-H2S, and I think we like that camera quite a bit. But now there's an X-H2, and I saw it has 40 megapixels, and I'm interested to talk about what the differences between them are. I want to know, do you regret not getting the X-H2, or do you what's the difference between the X-H2 and the X-H2S? Who should buy each camera?
I mean, I was gonna ask you. I mean, no regrets, or what do you think?
I mean, X-H2 does 8K. That's pretty cool. It
Yep.
would have been neat to be able to do that. Definitely having higher megapixels for photos is cool, but I don't think I regret my decision. I guess we'll get into why somebody would choose either camera. I think that the X-H2S is probably a better video camera.
It feels like that's kind of what they were trying to do. I mean, you have like your A7s and your A7Ss, and the S seems to always stand for video for some reason. I know it's like speed or, whatever. So, sure, like X-H2S for video, X-H2 for photo, but then you run into the Fuji problem where they have to put all the features of every camera in every camera, and then they release 50 of them, and then you're like, what's the difference between an XE4 and an XT30 Mark II?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, well, they're just the same. They just look different. And so it's the same thing here. Like, they come out with the X-H2S, and the buttons and the layout and the screen, everything hardware is exactly the same, except the sensor. And the sensor is not stacked. And so the main difference between the X-H2S and the X-H2 is literally what the sensor can do and what those read speeds can do. And so, your X-H2 can shoot 8K because it has the resolution for it. It can shoot the 6.2K like the X-H2S, but it doesn't shoot at open gate. It does support the ProRes, which is fantastic. It supports all the same codecs. It'll output RAW, I think. No, it doesn't. It doesn't output RAW.
I think it does.
Does it?
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Pretty sure it does.
It doesn't shoot as fast. Like your burst rates are maybe half of what you get on the X-H2S. It probably autofocuses just a little slower because it can't read the sensor, as quickly to read that many autofocus frames. But I mean, that's basically it. It's like, do you want to be able to shoot sports? Do you need to be able to shoot open gate? In that 3x2, and do you want slightly faster autofocus, or do you want 8K, maybe a little worse rolling shutter, and higher resolution photos, and cheaper?
It's honestly a pretty hard decision between them. They both seem like really good cameras. It's worth pointing out that you would look at them and you'd think that the X-H2 is clearly the photo camera, but it's really not that bad for video. I mean, it has almost all the same features, like you said. You still get some advantages of that higher megapixel sensor. Fuji's thing is that it seems like they downsample from the sensor. Like they never really take a crop, from a smaller portion of the sensor. It's always downsampling from, like on the X-H2S, it's downsampling from 6.2K for almost all the modes. And on the X-H2, I think it downsamples from the 8K.
It does. So you get really good looking footage, and if you're not filming something where there's a lot of movement where you might worry about the rolling shutter, then it's not a problem. And from what we're looking at, I know we're talking a lot about video, and it's like, it's a photo camera. But, a lot of the reviews that have come out thus far, the rolling shutter in the X-H2 is not any worse than something like the X-T4, because it has that newer processor in it. So it's not an XH2S, but it's still pretty good. And I think one quick thing that we also didn't cover as far as different is F-Log2. Mm-hmm. The XH2S will do because it can read so fast, it will do the 14-bit read on the sensor and then give you that extra stop or so of dynamic range in video.
Yeah, with F-Log2 specifically.
With F-Log2 specifically. F-Log1's the same on both cameras. F-Log2 is better on the XH2S. But then also, like, none of this matters for photos because you're shooting 14-bit RAW for photos regardless. Yeah. So it's like only specifically if like you need open gate or you need one extra stop of dynamic range or you need better rolling shutter, like why buy the XH2S for an extra $500?
Yeah, thinking about it, it's really surprising that there's that big of a price difference between the two.
Yeah, it is surprising.
If you really care about photos and if you don't need the specific things you just mentioned, yeah, it's like, why not just get the XH2? Now, is there a difference in the noise or in the low light performance? Because, I mean, same sensor size, but they're putting 40 megapixels in one versus 26 in the other. We always hear that having larger pixels lets in more light. Is there a difference there? Have you seen anything?
I haven't seen anything as far as noise performance. I think the noise performance on both these cameras is pretty incredible. I haven't seen anything that says that the XH2S is better significantly than the XH2 as far as its noise performance. But I would expect that maybe a smidge. I also think that a lot of the discussion of noise on these cameras where, people are like, oh, well, the noise just looks so good. I think a lot of that just comes down to X-trans and the pattern of the noise looks less uniform because the pixels are less uniform. And so you get this interesting X-trans noise kind of look.
You definitely sound like a Fuji fan right now.
I can't help myself. I love my Fuji. But I personally wanted 40 megapixels for photos. I wish I could crop in just a little more. I feel like 26 is okay, but I want more resolution for the pictures that I take. And that was one of the things I was looking forward to with the new Fuji cameras coming out. Because, I mean, a year ago, 2021, I was like, I'm going to buy the XH2 when it comes out. Like, that's what I'm going to do. It's got to be coming, September this year. And then September, they were like, just kidding, it's coming out next year. And so, I was eagerly waiting for it. And when the XH2S came out, I was like, pre-order right now. And they announced that they were going to come out with the XH2 in the Fuji Summit in May. And so, like, I knew it was coming, and we knew it was going to be 40 megapixels, and we knew it wasn't going to be stacked. And so that's why, maybe I took a day or two before I pre-ordered it. Because I was like, well, do I need to wait to see what the XH2 is going to be? Do I want those 40 megapixels? And to me, the stack sensor and stack sensors being like the next big thing, that was more important to me. And I wanted the stack sensor more than I wanted the higher resolution. Fuji hasn't released a official list, or they're about to. I mean, I saw it on Fuji Rumors, but not all of Fuji's lenses can resolve to 40 megapixels. I mean, you can take pictures with any of their lenses, but you're not going to get, as sharp of an image with something like the 16-1.4 as you are going to get with the 33-1.4, because the newer lenses have been they've been slowly re-releasing all of their primes to resolve to that. But buying into the XH2 right now, it's kind of a weird situation because maybe not all of your lenses can resolve to 40 megapixels, and then you might have to upgrade your lenses down the road. Or maybe if you want to get the most out of that resolution, you might only be able to get the most out of it with, half of your gear.
I'm curious if you'd actually even notice that difference.
I mean, you notice you're cropping into like 400%.
Yeah, but who's doing that? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But, one thing I thought about too is a feature that I really like on a lot of cameras now is that you can do some sort of crop mode where you can press a button and it takes a crop from a smaller portion of the sensors that you get a zoomed in. In fact, most of the cameras we've used have that. The A7 III has it, GH5, and the XH2S has that too. And it's just handy if you're shooting and you just need to get a little bit closer than what your lens can do. You press that button and it punches in. And it occurs to me that with the 40 megapixels, if it's downsampling from that 8K sensor, that might look a little bit better than what you get on a lower megapixel sensor. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess that's probably true. I mean, yeah, downsampled is always going to look better than pixel for pixel because it has more information to work with. I mean, you see that directly on the R5. I mean, the downsampled 4K versus the pixel for pixel 4K looks significantly better.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I regret getting the XH2S. I mean, I do like that it has less rolling shutter. It's just nice to not have to worry about that. Autofocus performance being faster is like a useful, important thing. I mean, those seem like good things, but I mean, I gotta say, I think if I was buying right now, I would at least give serious thought to the XH2. Not saying I'd go for it, but with a $500 difference between them, that's basically like buying another lens with the camera. And I was surprised, I guess, that it was so similar.
Yeah, I mean, you could walk away with a a 2314 and an XH2 for the price of an XH2S. If I was presented the option again, buy the XH2 or the XH2S, I would still buy the XH2S, mostly so that I can dunk on people who have an A7S III, because it has just as many stops of dynamic range, but with a smaller sensor.
And I guess that's kind of the thing that I keep forgetting is the 14-bit f-log2. I mean, that is something that I think is actually going to make an impact in images. If you're, or I guess in video rather, if you're shooting f-log2 and grading it, theoretically you should see a little bit better results there. And I mean, we're always looking for more dynamic range, so
right,
that's something you want to maximize. It's interesting. Honestly, I don't understand Fuji's strategy all the time. I feel like they release too many cameras that are too similar. And in this case, it's going to be really interesting 6 months or a year from now to see how many people are using the XH2 versus how many are using the XH2S.
The answer is they're all going to still be using Sony.
That's probably true.
Fuji is weird in that way that I really appreciate that they don't try to nerf their cameras. When they released the XH2, they didn't take ProRes and RAW out. They were like, we have these features, if it works, we're gonna ship it. And I really appreciate that. It does make their camera line a little weird, and that they're gonna release an XT5 somewhere down the road, and it's going to basically be an XH2S, but with the physical dials instead of the PSAM on top.
Yeah,
it's like, why am I gonna buy an XH2S when I can buy an XT5 that has like all the same features? So maybe they won't do it. I am curious to see like what they decide to keep and what they decide to not. Maybe they don't put the stack sensor into the XT5. Maybe it's 40 megapixel. But that's just kind of been Fuji's approach, is like all the features in every new camera. But it does make it kind of hard or maybe easy to pick between their lines. There's
a stark contrast there. I mean, if we kind of bring it back full circle, we started off today talking about Canon. And that is definitely not something that Canon does.
No,
and Canon has come under fire many times for nerfing some of their lower cameras. I saw somebody talking about this recently, and they pointed out that one big difference is that Canon has a cinema camera lineup, and so Canon's trying to protect that, and they want to have tangible features that make you move to C200, C300, whatever. Fuji, on the other hand, doesn't do that. Like Fuji doesn't make cinema cameras.
They make cinema lenses.
They make cinema lenses that cost ridiculous amounts of money, but they don't make cinema cameras. And so they have no reason to hold anything back from something like the XH2 or XH2S. Yeah. And I mean, that's definitely something that draws me to Fuji. It's nice knowing that everything the camera can do is in there. It's just interesting to see kind of the difference between their approaches there.
So if you had, if you were starting fresh, you didn't have any glass, any camera, and you're looking at an XH2, XH2S for between $2,000 and $2,500. Is there something else that you would consider over that? I mean, what are your other options for that price range?
Yeah, that's a good point, because we've kind of talked about that. It seems like it's in a unique spot in the market. I don't really know what's in the same boat. I guess the GH6 is around the same price.
Sure.
And maybe the GH6 is better for video in some ways. I don't really think it is, but
yeah, the GH6 has a lot of really great video features, but something like an A7 IV costs $2,500 brand new. And so like, you're directly competing with a full frame camera there, but I don't know what other full frames you're going to compete against. I mean, the Fuji is going to be more full featured than something like what is it, a Z50, and then
Canon R6.
Sure, Canon R6 is 2,500, 30.
Yeah, I think it's 2,500.
Okay, so you're looking at their low mid range for Canon. I would say the A7 IV is like the general use camera for Sony, and that's a pretty good camera, but their lenses are just so expensive.
Well, that was what turned me off of, when I was looking at cameras, that was what turned me off of Sony, was that I didn't want to pay for their lenses, because all of their lenses are $1,200 and up.
Yeah, I feel like it's a really important cross shop to look at. Is like you have your A7 IV and you have your XH2S, and obviously the big difference between those two cameras is full frame versus APS-C, and you have to decide like, does the sensor size matter? And ignoring like the lenses, because you could get some Sigma lenses for Sony and make them cheaper. I think the Fuji is still a better buy. I think that the colors are cooler, not like colder, but like film simulations and Eterna and F-Log 2. I mean, that's all great. And then you just get more like video features. It's a higher end camera. I would say it's more comparable to something like, the A1, right, rather than the A7 IV.
It's at least comparable with the A7S III.
Sure, yeah, definitely comparable to that.
Which is a full $1,000 more expensive.
And you get more codecs. Like the A7 IV doesn't shoot ProRes. It will shoot 10-bit internal finally. But I did this cross comparison whenever I bought my XT3. I was like, should I buy an XT3 for $1,800 or should I buy an A7 III for $2,000? And they're basically the same price, but whenever you're shooting 4K on an A7 III, it's shooting it at 50 megabits per second. Versus the XT3, I can shoot all intra 400 megabit per second and get a much higher fidelity image that I can color grade and do whatever I need to with. And I just feel like, as far as a complete package, the Fuji just has all of it. And unless you need like a bigger sensor or better autofocus, I have trouble, seeing why I'm going to get the A7 IV over the XH2S.
Yeah, if this is your first camera, I kind of agree. I mean, I think where Sony has a good advantage is that there's a clear progression through many of their cameras. You could start with something like an A6400. You could buy lenses that you can then use on an A7 IV, on an A7S III, on an FX3. You have kind of a clear upgrade path. Maybe that's a good thing about it, but at that $2,500 price point, I kind of agree with you. I think the Fuji makes more sense. I mean, clearly we both feel that way. We bought the camera, but right. I mean, it's a very strong competitor, and there's not really anything else out there that has comparable features at that price point.
No, they're in a really, really sweet spot right there. And I don't know, I guess like, there's such a push for full frame. It's like you can't be taken seriously if you're not full frame, and so obviously that's a big argument for the A7 IV. And I think the E lens mount is kind of the next thing. Like EF for the longest time was, that's what a lot of cinema cameras use. I mean, if you're not shooting, like really really expensive, anamorphic or PL or Leica, it's EF, and I think that E is maybe going to take that spot. Sony has their mount open, so like Sigma and Tamron and all these, like everyone makes everything for E, and you can find E mount glass used all over the place because everyone's using Sony. And so I think with like the prevalence of E mount, it's so ubiquitous. That's a pretty good reason to buy into that system.
Yeah, I mean, that is a point in its favor. I think even some cameras like the Ronin 4D support E-mount. Yeah. And that's a downside to Fuji. I mean, we're probably not going to see other camera makers supporting Fuji X-mount. We're lucky enough that there are third-party X-mount lenses, because that was not always a guarantee either.
I mean, are there any other competitors in that price bracket with those features? I mean, you could probably get a used S5.
I think like the S1, not the S1H, but the more photo-oriented S1, I think is around that price. But I mean, if you want to talk about lens prices, the L-mount lenses are the most expensive lenses I've ever seen for consumer cameras.
But that camera is getting pretty long in the tooth. But they ported over a lot of the S1H video features to the S1, and I mean, for $2,500, that's a pretty good option.
I mean, I think the S1's a competitor. I think if you're doing photos, definitely the R6 or the A7 IV would be competitors. And then for video, I think you have to look at the GH6 and the Blackmagic 6K and 6K Pro. Those are all in that range.
I guess we haven't talked at all about the OMD-EM1.
Is that a Micro Four Thirds?
Yeah,
that's Olympus, right?
Yeah, that's the new Olympus camera. That is the other camera that has a stacked sensor. and like it has incredible IBIS. And if you need something that shoots at a long range in a small package, I mean, it's a great option because, I mean, you get the 2x crop on it. And so you can have this like tiny little lens and you can shoot whatever, 1,000 millimeters versus, someone who's coming from full frame is like carrying, a log in front of them. And
Yeah, I mean, Micro Four Thirds is definitely nice for the size, but I can't imagine buying another Micro Four Thirds camera at this point. It just doesn't seem like there's enough future in that system.
I would agree. It feels like everyone's kind of moving away from it. And we've talked about stack sensors before and how, that's really closing the gap and trying to, maybe there's still some optimization for sensor size. I'll argue all day for APS-C. Like, I like the size of the cameras. I like the size of the lens. It's really close to Super 35, and I really like Super 35 because like film and all this stuff. And so I'm a big nerd about Super 35 and APS-C, and I feel like it gets a bad rap because it's not full frame. And then I will happily turn around and tell you that Micro Four Thirds is too small, and it's too noisy and doesn't get enough light, and I don't want to go back to Micro Four Thirds.
Yeah, I mean, I fought all those problems with the GH5. It was always a struggle not having enough light, and it's telling that I use the speed booster almost all the time with that camera because, it's basically like, how can I make up for the shortcomings of this camera?
Sure.
I mean, there are advantages to it. We mentioned the smaller lenses. I think IBIS probably works better on Micro Four Thirds because that lens is, or because the sensor's so small, and GH5 and GH6 have incredible IBIS that's probably still unmatched. I mean, the other thing though is just kind of a mentality thing. Like, I think the GH series is really interesting because Panasonic has not held back on those at all. The video features on the GH5 were incredible for their time, and it still holds up now. It's still the only camera in that price bracket that can show you a waveform, show you a vector scope, stuff like that. And I mean, those are definitely great features to have, and not something that most other camera manufacturers have done in cameras in that price bracket.
I still don't think that Micro Four Thirds is long for this world. It's sure the OMD came out and the GH6 came out, and like there's a lot of space for it for if you need the small camera or the long lens, but the OMD is 16 megapixels. The GH5 is maybe 20, and that's about all you're going to get out of it. And I know like resolution isn't everything, but whenever you're shooting photos, and especially if you want to print something, I feel the 23 is pushing it as far as megapixels, and I really would like something more. The 40 megapixels in the XH2 is the most we've ever seen in an APS-C camera. And I think that 40 is pretty good. I mean, that's comparable to a lot of the full frame market out there. And so I think that gives a little more life to APS-C as a sensor size option, especially when you're trying to optimize for it. We're not going to see a 40 megapixel Micro Four Thirds camera.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think they're going to last that much longer. That's why I have moved away from that system. And I mean, it's unfortunate, but it seems like technology has passed it by. I mean, if you need something that's that portable, then use your phone.
Sure. I mean, that's a really good point. Anything else we need to talk about?
I think we've just about covered it. That's going to do it for the show today. Thanks for joining us. And if you enjoyed it, we'd encourage you to rate us on iTunes and tell your photography friends about the show. Also, check out our website at cameragearpodcast.com to learn more or send us feedback and questions. We'll be back with more next week.